It is a Friday evening in November 1954. Outside, the fog is thick and yellow, clinging to the wet cobblestones of a terraced street in Manchester. Inside number 42, the air is heavy with the scent of damp plaster, coal smoke, and the sharp medicinal tang of carbolic soap. In the center of the living room, the only warm room in the house, sits a galvanized tin bath, dragged in from the rusty nail in the backyard. The fire is roaring in the black-leaded range, roasting your knees while a draft from the ill-fitting front door freezes your wet back. This is the weekly ritual of the tin bath. There is no running hot water here, no white porcelain suite, just a kettle boiling on the hob, a family taking turns in the same greying water. Father first, children last, and a modesty curtain made of a clothes horse draped with a towel. It is a scene of intimate, crowded poverty, yet bathed in the golden glow of the hearth, it is the beating heart of a home that, despite having almost nothing, felt like it had everything. To understand the scale of the crisis that defined the British housing landscape in the 1950s, we must first pull back the camera from that intimate living room and look at the skyline. If you stood on a hill overlooking Sheffield, Leeds, Glasgow, or the East End of London in 1955, you wouldn't see a city in the modern sense. You would see a sea of slate, endless, rhythmic waves of grey roofs and red brick chimneys stretching to the horizon, broken only by the towering smokestacks of the mills and factories that fed them. These were the back-to-backs, the architectural scars left behind by the Industrial Revolution. Built 80 or 100 years earlier to house the armies of workers who powered the empire, they were never designed for longevity, and certainly not for comfort. They were jerry-built, thrown up quickly and cheaply by mill owners who viewed their workers as little more than components in a machine. The design was brutally efficient. A 2-up, 2-down terrace meant exactly that. 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen, living room, and a scullery, and 2 rooms upstairs. But in a true back-to-back, the house shared its rear wall with another house behind it. There was no back door, there was no back garden, there was no through draft. The air inside these houses was stagnant, trapped in a brick box that had been soaking up the soot and grime of the city for a century. By the 1950s, Britain was supposedly entering a new Elizabethan golden age. We were building nuclear power stations. We were designing jet airliners like the Comet. We were talking about the white heat of technology. Yet, the reality for millions of working-class Britons was a life that Charles Dickens would have recognized instantly. The Luftwaffe had done its best to destroy these slums during the Blitz, smashing great holes in the terraces of Stepney and Bootle, but the housing shortage was so acute that many damaged houses were simply patched up and re-inhabited. These streets were dark canyons. The brickwork, originally red or yellow, had been stained a uniform, velvety black by decades of coal smoke. There were no trees, no grass verges, just the hard echo of boots on cobblestones and the dim glow of gas street lamps that struggled to cut through the smog. To live here was to live in the shadow of industry. You woke up to the factory hooter, you breathed the factory smoke, and you came home to a house that was essentially a brick dormitory for the factory workforce. It was a world of monochromatic toughness, where the very walls seemed to sweat the history of the struggle that had built them. If the street outside was grim, the situation inside these houses was a crisis of compression. The statistics of 1950s housing are startling. In cities like Glasgow and London, it was not uncommon to find densities of over 400 people per acre. To put that in human terms, imagine a standard 2-up, 2-down terrace. Now imagine 3 generations of the same family, living, sleeping, cooking, and dying within those 4 small rooms. Overcrowding was the defining feature of slum life. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist. In the 1950s, a bedroom was rarely occupied by a single person. It was a dormitory. You slept top to tail with your siblings, 2 at the head, two at the foot, in a bed that sagged in the middle like a hammock. In the other corner, partitioned off by a hung sheet or a makeshift curtain, might be your parents or perhaps an infirm grandparent coughing through the night. The physical fabric of the buildings was rotting around the inhabitants. These houses had been built without damp-proof courses. Moisture didn't just seep in, it conquered. Rising damp was a permanent lodger. It climbed the walls in dark, spreading stains that looked like maps of foreign countries. In many homes, the wallpaper, often layered 5 or 6 deep as tenants tried to paper over the cracks, would simply peel away in wet sheets. A common memory of 1950s children is the smell of that damp, a sweet, cloying, earthy musk that permeated clothes, bedding, and food. It was the smell of a house that was slowly dissolving. Then there was the wallpaper soup. In the winter, condensation would run down the walls in rivulets, collecting in puddles on the linoleum floor. But the damp brought something worse than rot. It brought the bugs. It is a subject often scrubbed from nostalgic memoirs, but the battle against vermin was a daily war for the 1950s housewife. Bedbugs, or red soldiers as they were sometimes known, lived in the crumbling plaster and the wooden bed frames. The smell of paraffin, used to wipe down the metal springs of the bed to kill the eggs, was the perfume of the bedroom. Cockroaches scuttled across the scullery floor when the light was turned on. Rats were commonplace in the yards, and yet, despite the squalor, there was a fierce, almost aggressive pride in maintaining standards. The slum landlord was the villain of the piece, a faceless figure who collected the rent, often controlled at artificially low levels by the government, giving him zero incentive to do repairs, but never fixed a leaking roof. So the tenants fought the decay themselves. You would walk into a house that the council had condemned as unfit for human habitation, and you would find the front step donkey stone to a brilliant white, the brass door knocker polished until it looked like gold, and the net curtains boiled snow white. It was a defiance against the dirt. The house might be falling down, but by God, it would fall down clean. It was a psychological war against the environment, a statement that said, "We live in a slum, but we are not slum people." If the damp was a constant enemy, the lack of sanitation was a daily humiliation. In the modern world, the bathroom is a place of sanctuary and privacy. In the 1950s, slum, it simply didn't exist. For the vast majority of families living in pre-war terraces, the toilet was not in the house. It was at the bottom of the yard, a brick shed known variously as the privy, the netty in the northeast, or the kazi. In winter, a trip to the toilet was a tactical expedition. You put on your coat and boots. You took a torch or a candle, and you braved the ice, the rain, and the spiders that thrived in the dark, damp brickwork. Often these toilets were shared between 2 or even 4 families. The key hung on a string by the back door. The hygiene was rudimentary at best. Toilet paper was a luxury. Instead, squares of newspaper were cut up and threaded onto a string. If you were posh, you might have a roll of izal, a terrifying, medicated paper that was shiny on one side, completely non-absorbent, and smelled of disinfectant. It was less like wiping and more like smearing, but it was the standard issue cleanliness of the decade. At night, the journey to the yard was deemed too perilous or too cold, especially for children. Enter the Gezunder, so called because it goes under the bed. The ceramic chamber pot was a fixture of every bedroom. The reality of waking up in a freezing room, with the condensation thick on the windows, and using a pot while your siblings slept inches away, is a memory that defines the lack of privacy in this era. The sloping out ritual the next morning, carrying the full pots through the house to empty them in the outside drain or the privy, was a grim daily chore that fell inevitably to the mother. Hygiene extended to the clothes on your back, and wash day was a weekly marathon of physical endurance, usually held on a Monday. Without washing machines, The kitchen or the scullery became a steam room. The copper, a large metal boiler often built into the corner of the room, was fired up with coal or gas. Clothes were boiled, agitated by hand with a dolly, a wooden plunger, then dragged out, heavy and scalding, to the sink. Then came the mangle. This cast-iron beast stood in the yard or the scullery. You fed the sodden sheets and shirts between the wooden rollers while turning a heavy handle to squeeze the water out. It was back-breaking work that required significant upper body strength. It was also dangerous. Many a 1950s child carries a scar on their finger from getting too close to the nip of the rollers. To see a line of washing blowing in the smoggy wind was not just a sign of cleanliness. It was a flag of victory raised by a woman who had fought the grime of the city with nothing but boiling water and elbow grease. Because the houses were so small, claustrophobic boxes where you couldn't swing a cat without hitting a drying rack or a grandparent, life naturally spilled out onto the street. The Victorian terraced street was not just a thoroughfare, it was a communal living room. It was the playground, the debating chamber, and the social network of the 1950s. The boundary between the house and the street was the front step, and this humble slab of stone was treated with religious reverence. In the north of England especially, there was the ritual of donkey stoning. A donkey stone was a hard block of scouring stone, usually cream or white, or sometimes brown. Once a week, women would get down on their hands and knees to scrub the front step until it was pristine, then draw a perfect chalky border around the edge. To have a dirty step was a social death sentence. It signaled to the entire street that you had let yourself go. A gleaming white step was a flag of respectability planted in the middle of the grime. For the children, the street was a kingdom. In an era before widespread car ownership, the roads belonged to the pedestrians. You didn't play in your room. There was no room in your room. You played on the cobbles. The air was filled with the chanting of skipping rhymes, the clatter of tin cans being kicked, and the thud of leather footballs against brick walls. Games were seasonal and appeared by magic. One week it was marbles, played in the gutter. The next it was whip and top, and then suddenly everyone was playing conkers. The architecture itself facilitated this community. The entry, or ginnel, the narrow alleyway that ran behind the backyards, was a secret world of gossip and shortcuts. It was where deals were struck, where first kisses were stolen, and where the rag-and-bone man would steer his horse and cart, shouting for old iron and clothes in exchange for a goldfish in a plastic bag. But the most defining characteristic of the slum street was the open-door policy. It is the cliché of every nostalgia documentary, but it is a cliché because it was true. You could leave your front door unlocked. Neighbors didn't knock. They shouted, "Cooey," and walked in. This wasn't just friendliness. It was a survival mechanism. In a community where everyone was equally poor, you relied on each other. If you ran out of sugar, you borrowed a cup from next door. If a mother was sick, the neighbor fed her kids. This closeness meant there was no anonymity. Privacy was the price you paid for security. Every net curtain had an eye behind it. If a child misbehaved 3 streets away, their mother would know about it before they got home. A neighbor had the authority to clip a child round the ear for cheek, and the parents would thank them for it. It was a self-policing society, a tight-knit web of surveillance and support that made these dark, smoky streets feel like the safest places on earth. The end of the Victorian slum didn't come with a whimper, nor did it come with a bang. It came with a knock at the door from a man in a suit holding a clipboard. Throughout the mid-1950s, a new phrase began to whisper through the entries and across the backyard fences, a phrase that carried more weight than any bomb. Compulsory purchase order. The government had decided that the back-to-backs were a national embarrassment. The Housing Repairs and Rents Act of 1954 kicked off a massive wave of slum clearance that would sweep across Britain for the next 15 years. To the planners in Whitehall, looking at maps and models, These streets were cancerous cells that needed to be cut out to save the patient. To the people living there, it was a terrifying, bewildering eviction from the only world they had ever known. The process was brutal in its efficiency. A street would be surveyed, and the houses, some of which had stood for a century, witnessing births, deaths, and weddings, were stamped with a damning legal label, unfit for human habitation. It was a humiliating designation. It told the proud woman who donkey-stoned her step every Friday that she was living in a pigsty. Then came the CPO. This wasn't a negotiation. You weren't asked if you wanted to sell. The council simply took possession. For owner-occupiers, the compensation was often derisory, sometimes just site value, meaning they were paid for the land the house stood on, but not the bricks and mortar of the home itself. A family might receive $50 for a house that contained 50 years of memories. The death of a street was a slow, agonizing process. It didn't happen overnight. Families were moved out piecemeal as new council houses became available. One by one, the windows would be boarded up with corrugated iron or rough timber. A street that had once bustled with noise and life began to look like a smile with missing teeth. The corner shop, seeing its customers vanish, would close its doors for the last time. The local pub, the local, would call final orders and fall silent. Then the machines arrived. The sight of a wrecking ball swinging into a terrace row is one of the defining images of 1950s and 60s Britain. There was something deeply voyeuristic and tragic about it. As the front walls were ripped away, the interior lives of the residents were exposed to the open air. You could see the layers of wallpaper in the bedroom. Roses, stripes, geometric patterns, flapping in the wind. You could see the outline of where the staircase had been, the fireplace on the second floor hanging in the void. For the children, the demolition sites were adventure playgrounds, dangerous landscapes of broken bricks and dust. But for the older generation, watching the bulldozers was heartbreaking. They stood on the corners, clutching their shopping bags, watching their marital home, the room where their children were born, and the kitchen where they had peeled a mountain of potatoes, crumble into a cloud of red dust. The planners called it progress. The residents called it the end of the world. If the demolition was the funeral of the old life, the moving day was the birth of the new. For hundreds of thousands of families, the journey from the slum to the estate was a short drive in a removal van that spanned a century of social progress. They packed their belongings, often little more than a few sticks of furniture, a pile of bedding, and the prized china cabinet, into the back of a coal lorry or a hired van, and drove out of the smoke. The destination was often a new estate built on the edge of the city. Places with names that sounded pastoral and green. Withenshaw in Manchester, Kirby in Liverpool, or Becontree in Dagenham. Or, increasingly as the decade wore on, the destination was vertical. The brave new world of the Tower Block. Arriving at the new council house was a moment of genuine, dizzying shock. To a family used to the dark, cramped confinement of a back-to-back, the sheer sense of space was overwhelming. These new houses had front gardens. They had back gardens. They had windows that let in light from both sides. The air smelled of fresh paint and cut grass, not damp plaster and soot. But the true miracle, the moment that is etched into the memory of every person who made that move, awaited them inside. It was the bathroom. For a child who had only ever known a tin bath in front of the fire, walking into a dedicated room solely for washing felt like entering a palace. There it was, a gleaming white porcelain bath fixed to the floor, and at the end of it, 2 chrome taps. You turned the one marked H, and hot water, miraculous, steaming hot water, gushed out instantly. No boiling kettles, no lighting fires, no waiting. It was a luxury that, until that moment, had belonged only to the rich. And next to it, the indoor toilet. a flush toilet inside the house that didn't freeze in winter and didn't smell of the night soil men. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. It was a restoration of dignity. You could go to the bathroom in your pajamas without putting on a coat. It was a liberation. The kitchen, too, was a revelation. In the slum, the kitchen was the living room, the washroom, and the dining room all in one. Here, it was a fitted kitchen. There were cupboards with doors that closed properly. There was a gas cooker that wasn't rusted. There were electric sockets on the walls. It was a labor-saving workspace designed for the modern woman. For the first few weeks, families wandered around these new homes in a state of reverence. They whispered, as if afraid to disturb the perfection. They were terrified of scratching the new linoleum or marking the pristine walls. It felt like they had won the football pools. The council, the benevolent landlord, had given them a castle. They had escaped the grime, the bugs, and the dark. They had arrived in the future, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed perfect. The honeymoon period with the indoor toilet and the hot water did not last forever. As the weeks turned into months, a strange and unsettling silence began to descend over the new estates. The families had moved, but the community had not. In the old slum streets, life was lived at a volume of 10. You heard your neighbor fighting, loving, and singing through the thin walls. You heard the children playing on the cobbles. You heard the rag-and-bone man. But in the new semi-detached houses of the suburbs, or the concrete fortresses of the new towns, there was a heavy, suffocating quiet. The architecture of the new world was designed for privacy, and it succeeded too well. The back-to-back had forced people together. The council estate pulled them apart. Now there were front gardens with hedges that needed trimming. There were fences. There were long driveways. The physical distance between front doors had increased from 3 feet to 30 feet. You could no longer stand on your step and have a conversation with the woman 3 doors down without shouting. And so the doors closed. The open door policy, the sacred rule of the slum, died a quiet death in the suburbs. You didn't walk into someone's house uninvited anymore. You knocked. You waited. Eventually, you stopped visiting altogether. The spontaneous, chaotic support network of the terrace, where grandmothers, aunts, and cousins often lived on the same street, was shattered. The planners had moved the nuclear family, but they had left the extended family behind, often scattering them to different estates miles apart across the city. This isolation birthed a new medical phenomenon, new town blues, or suburban neurosis. Doctors in places like Kirby, Harlow, and Stevenage began to see a wave of young mothers suffering from depression. These women, who had once spent their days chatting in the communal wash house or the corner shop, were now trapped in their pristine modern kitchens, miles from their mothers, with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. They had hygiene, they had space, but they were lonely. But nowhere was this loss of community more tragic than in the tower blocks. The architects had promised streets in the sky. They believed that by stacking streets vertically, they could recreate the community of the slums in a modern, light-filled concrete monolith. They were wrong. A street is a place where you can stand and talk. A corridor on the 14th floor is a place where you hurry to your door. There was no donkey stoning the doorstep on the 10th floor. There was nowhere for the children to play within sight of their mothers. If a child went down to the concrete playground 18 stories below, they were gone. The mother couldn't lean out of the window and shout them in for tea. The lifts, which were supposed to be the vertical pavements, became zones of fear. They smelled of urine and stale smoke. They broke down constantly, trapping the elderly in their flats, turning the sky-high luxury into a high-altitude prison. The vertical village didn't create neighbors. It created strangers who shared a postcode. The slum had been horizontal and dirty, but it was warm. The block was vertical and clean, but it was stone cold. There is a profound irony in how we view these lost streets today. If you walk through the surviving pockets of Victorian terraces in places like Islington in London or parts of Bristol and Manchester, you are no longer looking at slums. You are looking at period properties. The very same two-up, two-down houses that the council officers condemned as vermin-infested hovels in 1955 are now selling for fortunes. The brickwork has been sandblasted back to its original warm yellow or red. The outside toilets have been converted into utility rooms or garden sheds for expensive bicycles. The coal fires have been reopened to burn kiln-dried logs for aesthetic pleasure, not survival. We gaze at these buildings now through the rose-tinted lens of heritage. We watch TV shows like Peaky Blinders or Call the Midwife, where the smoke and the grime are rendered cinematic and moody. We romanticize the cobbles and the gas lamps. We have gentrified the memory of the slum. We have forgotten that for the people inside them, those picturesque sash windows rattled in the wind, and those charming original floorboards were riddled with woodworm. But there is also a sense of architectural tragedy. In our rush to modernize, to sweep away the old, we were often too heavy-handed. The sledgehammer of the 1960s planners didn't just knock down the uninhabitable slums. It knocked down entire neighborhoods that could have been saved. We destroyed the unique character of British cities, replacing intricate Victorian brickwork with the grey, brutalist concrete of the Arndale centres and the multi-storey car parks. We threw the baby out with the bathwater. We cured the damp, yes. We cured the rickets and the tuberculosis that thrived in the dark alleys. But in doing so, we sterilized our cities. We wiped away the physical history of the working class. When a terrace is flattened, the history of the families who lived there, the pencil marks on the doorframe measuring a child's height, the worn dip in the stone step, is turned to dust. Today, looking at the concrete monoliths that replaced them, many of which are now being demolished, themselves because they failed, we are left with an uncomfortable question. Did we make a mistake? Should we have fitted bathrooms into the terraces instead of knocking them down? It is easy to say yes with the benefit of hindsight and central heating. But ask the woman who spent 20 years scrubbing a stone floor with freezing water, and she will tell you a different story. To her, the bulldozer wasn't a tragedy. It was a liberation vehicle. It is easy for us, sitting in our warm, dry, centrally heated homes, to look back at the photographs of 1950s slums with nothing but horror. We see the grime on the faces of the children, the peeling wallpaper, and the outdoor toilets, and we shudder. We pity the people who live there. We see them as victims of a cruel, primitive past that we have thankfully escaped. But if you sit down with the people who actually lived in those unfit houses, the generation now in their 80s and 90s, you will rarely hear them talk about the misery. They don't talk about the bed bugs or the cold walks to the privy. They talk about the noise. They talk about the laughter that echoed through the thin walls. They talk about the smell of baking bread drifting from an open door, and the certainty that, if they fell, a dozen pairs of hands would be there to catch them before they hit the cobbles. We have gained so much since the bulldozers did their work. We have banished the damp that rotted our lungs. We have hot water on demand and privacy behind our locked doors. We are cleaner, we are healthier, and we are undoubtedly more comfortable. But in sanitizing our streets, we perhaps scrubbed away something vital. We traded the open door for the burglar alarm. We traded the gossip of the wash house for the isolation of the washing machine. We traded a community where everyone knew your name for a housing estate, where you can live for 10 years without knowing the person next door. The story of the 1950s slum is the story of a trade-off. We bought our physical comfort with the currency of our social connection. And while no one in their right mind would trade a modern bathroom for a tin bath in front of a coal fire, there are nights, perhaps when the street outside is silent and the blue light of the television flickers in an empty room, when we might wonder if we left the most important part of the home back there in the rubble.